I had known Diane Whitfield for 11 years before that night, and in all that time, I had never once called her by her first name. She was always Mrs. Whitfield, the woman who made grilled cheese sandwiches cut into triangles when I stayed over at her house in 6th grade, the woman who cried harder than my own mother did at my college graduation, the woman who kept a photograph of me and her son, Caleb, on her refrigerator long after Caleb and I stopped being close. I hadn't seen her in almost 2 years. I hadn't seen Caleb in longer than that, not since the funeral, not since the last time either of us could stand to look at each other without seeing our dead friend's face reflected back. I was driving through the mountains that December because I was running from something, though I would not have admitted that to anyone, least of all myself. My father had died in October, quietly in his sleep, the kind of death people call peaceful and merciful. Though I had come to understand, there is nothing peaceful about the silence that follows. I had taken 2 weeks off work and told everyone I was going to visit my sister in Denver, but I never called her. Instead, I rented a cabin 40 minutes outside a town I didn't know, because I wanted to be somewhere that had never known my father, somewhere his absence couldn't follow me into every room. The storm came faster than the forecast predicted. I remember the radio announcer's voice cutting in and out, warning drivers to get off the roads, and I remember thinking I was close enough to the cabin that it didn't matter. I was wrong. Somewhere along a 2-lane road with no shoulder and no streetlights, my car slid into a ditch so quietly I almost didn't feel it happen, just a soft lurch and then the sickening stillness of tires spinning against snow that offered no resistance at all. I sat there for a long time before I called anyone. I think some part of me wanted to freeze. I think some part of me had been wanting that since October. Some quiet, shameful part I hadn't looked at directly. But the cold has a way of making liars out of the parts of us that claim to want to disappear, and eventually my hands were shaking too hard to hold the phone, and survival, ordinary and stubborn, took over. My phone had 1 bar of signal and a battery at 9%. I scrolled through contacts with numb fingers, past names of people who lived hours away, past co-workers who wouldn't have known what to do with a call like this, and I stopped on a name I hadn't dialed in 2 years. I don't know why I called her. Maybe because some part of me remembered that her house, the last time I'd visited Caleb there, was only 15 minutes from where I now sat. Maybe because in the moment your body starts believing it might die, it reaches backward for whoever it associates with safety. And for me, despite everything, despite the silence between us since the funeral, that was still Diane Whitfield. She answered on the second ring. Her voice hadn't changed at all, still warm, still edged with the particular brightness she used with people she loved. And when I told her where I was, she didn't hesitate. She didn't ask why I hadn't called sooner, why I was in town without telling her, why 2 years of silence had led to this moment. She just said, "Stay in the car. Keep the heat running if you can. I'm coming," and hung up before I could tell her not to. She found me 40 minutes later, her old Subaru crawling along the road with its hazards blinking through the white. I remember the relief of her headlights more than almost anything else from that year, more than the hospital lights the night my father died, more than the porch light of my childhood home. She got out into snow that came up past her ankles, wearing a coat too thin for the storm, and she half carried, half walked me to her car because my legs had gone stiff with cold and fear. The heat in her Subaru didn't work well, some fault in the system she'd been meaning to fix for months, and by the time we'd gone 2 miles, it was clear we weren't making it back to her house. The road ahead was already impassable, drifts swallowing the center line. And when her car began to slide, she pulled off into the gravel lot of a shuttered gas station and turned off the engine before we could get stuck somewhere worse. That was when she took off her coat. I told her not to. I remember saying it twice, my voice cracking with cold and something that felt embarrassingly close to tears, but she wrapped it around my shoulders anyway, over my own coat, layering warmth onto me like she was trying to armor me against something larger than the storm. "You're not alone tonight," she said, and I have turned that sentence over in my mind 1,000 times since, trying to understand why it undid me the way it did, why I started crying in a dead gas station parking lot in a blizzard, in front of a woman I had spent 2 years avoiding. We sat in that car for 6 hours. The snow didn't let up until nearly 4 in the morning, and somewhere in those hours, wrapped in her coat in the dark, With the windows slowly frosting over from our breath, I told her everything. I told her about my father, about the 2 weeks I'd lied about the cabin I'd rented to disappear into. And then, because the dark makes confessions easier than daylight ever does, I told her the thing I had never said to anyone. Not my mother, not my sister, not a single person in 2 years. I told her I blamed myself for Caleb. We had been driving back from a concert. I was supposed to take his keys because he'd had more to drink than I had. And I didn't because he insisted he was fine. Because I didn't want the fight. Because it was easier to let him believe he was in control of a car than it was to take that control from him. I had spent 2 years telling myself there was nothing I could have done, and 2 years not believing a single word of it. Diane was quiet for a long time after I said it. Long enough that I thought I had finally, truly broken something between us, said the one thing that would turn her grief into hatred. But when she spoke, her voice wasn't angry. It was tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. I blame myself too, she said. I blamed myself every day for 2 years. I told him he could take the car that night. I told him to have fun. I was so happy he had a friend as steady as you, someone who'd get him home safe, that I never even considered you'd let him make his own choice. I built a version of that night where you failed him, because it was easier than admitting I was the one who handed him the keys. I hadn't known that. In 2 years of silence, I had built an entire architecture of guilt around myself, certain that Diane's absence from my life was a verdict, a judgment quietly delivered and never revoked. I hadn't considered that she might have been carrying her own version of the same weight, walking around with her own private courtroom, convicting herself in a language I never got to hear. Why didn't you ever say anything? I asked her. Why did you let me disappear? Because I thought you needed distance from us, she said, from everything that reminded you of him. I thought that was love, letting you go quietly instead of making you carry my grief on top of your own. I think about you all the time, you know. I kept his last text messages, and one of them is to you. Some stupid joke about a video game, and I read it sometimes just to remember his voice. I hadn't thought about how much I'd taken from her, the silence I'd made her endure because grief made me a coward. Caleb had been her only son. I had been the boy who slept over every weekend for a decade, who ate her cooking and borrowed her printer and once called her at 2 a.m. during a bad breakup because I didn't know who else to call. And after he died, I had let that whole relationship collapse into nothing, because staying close to her meant staying close to a grief I didn't know how to survive. The storm broke a little after 4, the wind dying down enough that the plows could finally get through, their headlights sweeping past us around 5 a.m. like search beacons. By then, the car had gone cold again, and we were sitting shoulder to shoulder for warmth, her coat still around me, my arm around her, and I don't think either of us had slept, but neither of us minded staying awake. There was something in that stillness that felt necessary, like 2 years of unspoken things had finally found the only room quiet enough to hold them. When the plows cleared enough of the road, she drove me not to the cabin, but to her house, the same house with the same kitchen where I'd eaten 1,000 meals as a kid. She made coffee at 6 a.m, and we sat at her table while the sun came up gray and exhausted over the snow, and she showed me that text message, Caleb's last joke, sent to me 3 days before the accident, something about a video game we used to argue about. I hadn't opened it in 2 years. I'd been too afraid of what it would feel like to read his name again. Still labeled in my phone the way it had been since high school, still capable of texting me back if the universe worked differently than it does. I stayed at her house for 4 days after that. The roads too dangerous to drive until the county cleared them properly. And in those 4 days, something that had been frozen for 2 years finally began to thaw. We talked about Caleb the way you're supposed to talk about people you've lost. Not carefully, not around the edges, but directly, with his mistakes and his laugh and his terrible taste in music all included, all still allowed to exist in the room with us. Diane showed me photo albums I hadn't seen since I was 14, and I helped her fix a loose hinge on her kitchen cabinet that had been bothering her for months. And on the last night before I left, she told me she didn't think of me as her son's friend anymore, not really. She said somewhere in those years, without either of us noticing, I had just become someone she loved on my own account, independent of him, independent of the grief that had first bound us and then nearly broke us apart. I drove home 3 days before Christmas, her coat still smelling faintly of her perfume in my back seat, because she'd insisted I take it, said I needed something warm for the rest of the drive. I call her every week now, not out of obligation, not out of guilt, but because I've learned that the people who show up for us in a storm, literal or otherwise, are not accidents. They are not simply convenient. They are, if we let them be, the beginning of a family we choose for ourselves when the family we were given has been rearranged by loss into something unrecognizable. My father is still gone. Caleb is still gone. Nothing about that December fixed what could never be fixed. And I don't believe in stories where grief gets neatly resolved, tied off like a wound that stops hurting simply because enough time has passed or enough words have finally been spoken. But I believe now in a way I didn't before that night, that grief doesn't have to be carried alone, that it doesn't have to isolate the people who share it, and that sometimes the person who saves you from freezing in a ditch on the side of a mountain road is also the person who has been waiting, just as desperately as you, for someone to finally say the thing that lets both of you breathe again. Diane still keeps that photograph of me and Caleb on her refrigerator. She's added new ones since then, pictures from Thanksgiving, from a hiking trip we took in the spring, evidence of a relationship that survived its own near death and came out changed but intact. Sometimes when I visit, I catch her looking at the old photo the way you look at something sacred. And I understand now that she isn't looking at what she lost. She's looking at what, against every reasonable expectation, she still has. And so am I.